everybody, welcome back to 35-week test review for U.S. history. This is part 2. Why is it better than part 1? Because it's part 2, duh. Alright, so just really quickly, test Tuesday, 50 multiple choice, everything up through the 1960s. How much is this going to count? Double test grade, you better study. I'm glad you're watching though, thank you. Alright, so we are talking government, okay? Where we left off, we were talking about the Great Compromise. We're talking government, okay? So, explain how federalism is structured, basically, here in the United States. So first off, what is federalism? Federalism is the division of power between the state and national governments. Do you need to know that? Yes. Do you need to know that for the regions too? So it's really, really important. And it's kind of cool though that, we've got a whole bunch of governments all in one. We're like a little Matryoshka doll or something. And then on top of the wonder that is that, there are different ways that the powers are structured. So first we have delegated powers. Those are the things that only the national government has, like declaring war, like coining money, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I can't think of other things. It's morning when I'm recording this right now, so maybe brain cells not working. Declaring war, money, managing Indian affairs. That was one of the original things. Managing interstate trade. All those things delegated only the national government. Because think about it, if New Jersey could declare war, they would just be declaring war on everyone, and it would just be ridiculous. Then we have concurrent powers. Those are powers that both the state and national government has. Like taxing. So if you work and you get a paycheck, you definitely know that you have state taxes that come out and you have federal taxes that come out. Laws. There are federal laws, there are state laws. Courts. There are state courts, there are federal courts. Those are all examples of concurrent powers. Reserve powers are things that only belong to the states. So, if you watch the news ever, you would know that marriage is something that's handled on a state-by-state basis. So, yeah, if I want to get married in Nevada, and, that's why people will go to Vegas to get married, because, hey, you can get a marriage license and get married really quickly, whereas in New York, it takes a little bit longer of time. Who can get married in each state, and what the marriages look like, and how divorces happen, that's all different state by state. As is education for the most part, although that's getting a little tricky now with things like No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, licensing professionals. I'm licensed to teach here in New York. I'm not licensed to teach in Connecticut. Connecticut's only a couple miles away. I can't teach there. I could get a license though. That'd be fun. What's the purpose of the system of checks and balances? Well, other than just being super cool and getting to say checks and balances, it prevents one branch from overpowering the other ones. And we were just talking about with the Articles of Confederation that the reason we made it as weak as it was we were really, really afraid of having mistakes that had happened in the past, like having a king that would overpower things. So they've learned from those mistakes. They've learned that, hey, we need to have a more complex government, but we still don't want bad things to happen. So we need to have those checks and balances. And so if you wanted to pause it here, you could actually look at this. I'm actually going to go into some of it in the next slide, but I like this. This is a neat little charty-do. That's right, I said charty-do, for you to check out and kind of see what the deal is, who can do what. Alright, so one way that each branch can check another branch. You know what? I'm an overachiever. I'm going to name more than one. So yeah, the legislative branch, they can impeach people. It's not just the president. They can impeach their own members. They can impeach judges. And remember, impeachment just means being brought up on charges. It does not mean that you're kicked out of office. You are not kicked out of office if you're impeached. In fact, we've had 2 presidents who have been impeached. Neither one kicked out of office. They can override vetoes. They can approve presidential appointments. So when we're talking about presidential appointments, we're talking about when they appoint ambassadors or cabinet members or judges, and they can ratify treaties. Well, oh my gosh, what can the executive do? And oh my god, please, 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 if you're looking at this and you're like, who is in the legislative branch? You need to stop. You need to pause this. You need to watch my Constitution review videos, because that talks about who's in there. And if you're like, I don't know who the legislative is or what they do, seriously, watch that, because that's really important. I'm not going into that here. Okay, I can't help myself though. It's the Congress. It's the Congress. And who's the executive? It's the president. So they veto. They're like, oh, I don't like this law. I'm going to veto it. Those guys override it. They can appoint government officials, like I was talking about, cabinet, judges, ambassadors, and they can do a few other things, like they make treaties, or they can, pardon people. But for right now, I'm good with this. Judicial, and I know it sounds kind of cheesy that they only have one thing, but it's a really powerful thing. They have judicial review, which is the power to decide whether laws are constitutional, which is pretty nifty. All right, so listen, there are, you do not need to memorize the First Amendment. Like, that's just craziness. But you need to recognize what is in the First Amendment. So, for example, if I were to say to you, hey, they're going to take somebody's right to have a gun away. Like, you need to know, hang on, is that part of the First Amendment? Oh, hang on, no, it's not. Like, I'm not asking you to know what amendment, like, no. Like, you just need to recognize them. So, yeah, there's freedom of press, okay, so news and whatnot. Speech, so you could say what you want. Particularly, they're talking about saying things against the government. Like, your speech is not completely free, as we know. We've talked about that with a bunch of Supreme Court cases. Religion. Again, it's not like freedom of religion that I can, become a cat killer. Sorry, Zoe's right next to me looking at me. I would never kill you, Zoe. Freedom of assembly. Yeah, you can get together in a group and you can talk about things. And freedom of petition. And basically, yeah, you can all sign something saying, hey, you know what, government? I don't like how you're doing something. And they won't take your name, see your name there and be like, ha ha ha, I can arrest you. By the way, I just did it with like the cool hand thing. Ooh, can you hear it? My hands. Like with the evil hands. Never mind. Stop talking, Clemens. Okay. So in the last slide, when we're talking about federalism, and we said, oh, there's, concurrent, reserved, delegated powers. Well, there's these other super nifty powers, and they're called implied powers. Because we like to make things as complicated as possible, the implied powers are also known as other things, like the elastic clause and the necessary and proper clause. I would love to just have you know those two, because honestly it's a little bit easier. Like, you just think of like, ooh, my sweatpants, they let like the extra poundage happen, or necessary and proper. Oh, that makes sense. I know what necessary and proper means. You need to know, if you see implied powers, that that's what those two things are. So what do they do to allow the Constitution to be flexible? You can stretch the Constitution with this loose interpretation. So think of loose with my elastic sweatpants. Don't think about it. It's kind of gross. Some examples from throughout history where people have used implied powers, aka the elastic clause, aka the necessary and proper clause, would be like Hamilton having the bank. Does it say anywhere in the Constitution you can have a national bank? No. Seriously, look through the Constitution. Bank is not mentioned, okay? But Hamilton does it. He says, hey, I could do it because I have loose interpretation. Thomas Jefferson, he, doesn't have the exact permission of Congress. He only had the permission of Congress to buy New Orleans, and instead they buy the whole territory, and he's like, how do I do this? He uses loose interpretation and says, oh yeah, I have the power to negotiate treaties, so yep, I can totally do that. I don't care that Congress didn't approve it beforehand. FDR having the New Deal, saying, you know what, people are starving, so maybe let's take care of that. You can add a million more things to this, like Homeland Security. You can add like NASA. You can add like the Environmental Protection Agency. There are a bazillion examples. Honestly, anything that's not written in the Constitution that the government has done, loose interpretation, my friend, loose interpretation. All right, let's see if we get this slide done real quick. What's the unwritten Constitution? It's things that aren't actually, if you can believe it, written in the Constitution, but they're there because of tradition. So, for example, George Washington was like, dude, I can't do everything on my own, because that's how he talked back then. And so he's like, oh, I'm gonna have a cabinet. Well, check this out. John Adams was like, well, if he had a cabinet, I want to have one. And everybody else had one too. Political parties. It's not written in the Constitution to have political parties. Honestly, How cool would it be to not have political parties? But we have them. They've been there since the beginning. We're probably always going to have them. The two-term presidency is a fun one in that George Washington was like, dude, I'm running my 2 times, and I'm going to go home, I'm going to hang out for a little bit, and I'm going to die. And then that's kind of what everybody else said afterwards. They're like, well, George Washington, only served for 2 terms, and then he went home and died. I'm going to do that too. And so Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and ever onward, they keep doing that until FDR, who is just... He's like, no, you know what, dude? I'm running for a 3rd time. We're in the Great Depression. Things are crazy. And then he goes, you know what? What the hey? I'm going to run a 4th time. We're in World War II now. Afterwards, then they make an amendment. So when you have the question about the 2-term presidency, you have to look at it. If they're talking about why now do we have a 2-term presidency, that's an amendment, my friend. If they're talking about previously, it's a precedent, an example, and that is our good friend unwritten Constitution. Sometimes they bring up congressional committees. Yeah, it doesn't say that we have that in the Constitution either. We have committees. It's good times. What was the significance of the case of Marbury versus Madison? Well, first off, it's the first time they had M&Ms. No, I'm just kidding. I really made that up, and I swear to God, if you ever write that on a Regents, I will find you. Now, this is our good friend John Marshall, who presides over this case, and they established the principle of judicial review. Do you really need to know? Like, honestly, for multiple choiceness, the whole idea of who Marbury was and who Madison was, no. If you want to know more of the details for it, for writing an essay, when we get to the Regents, look at my Supreme Court review. And, hey, if you have already forgotten what judicial review is, it's the ability of the Supreme Court to decide whether or not laws are constitution. Oh, Constitution. Oh. Okay, guys, that is it for part 2. Tune in soon for part 3.